Tornado coming. Leave the bikes, get underground. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for the sirens. Rachel Monroe grabbed a red tablecloth off the nearest table, ran into the middle of Highway 17, and started screaming at 79 Hells Angels riders barreling through 40-mile-an-hour crosswinds. Most people in Briar Glen had locked their doors the moment they saw those leather patches. Rachel Monroe ran toward them. And what happened next would change this town forever. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Rachel Monroe had been closing up the Prairie Lantern Cafe for 11 years. And in 11 years, she had learned to read the sky the way other people read a clock, not by checking it constantly, just by knowing, somewhere in her body, when something was wrong. That afternoon, something was very wrong. It wasn't the color of the clouds, though that was bad enough, a bruised green-gray that didn't belong to any normal Kansas afternoon. It wasn't the drop in air pressure, though she felt that too, a sudden tightness behind her eyes that reminded her of the migraines her mother used to get before bad weather. What stopped Rachel mid-step, what made her set down the stack of menus she was carrying and walk slowly to the front window, was the silence. The wind chimes above the cafe door had been singing all day, gentle, then insistent, then frantic as the gusts picked up after noon. Now they were completely still, not slowing down, still. The kind of stillness that isn't peace, it's the world holding its breath. Rachel had volunteered with Briar Glen's emergency dispatch for 6 years before she took over the cafe, full-time after her father's illness. 6 years of listening to weather radio at 2 in the morning, of learning the difference between a watch and a warning, of understanding that the most dangerous moment in any tornado event is not the storm itself, it's the 6 minutes before anyone officially admits it's coming. She knew what falling pressure felt like. She knew what circling debris looked like against a low sky. She knew what the distant sound of a freight train meant when there were no tracks within 15 miles. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass and felt the vibration before she heard it. "Danny," she called toward the kitchen. "Danny, go to the cellar." Her part-time cook appeared in the doorway, a dish towel over his shoulder, an expression of mild confusion on his face. Danny Pruitt was 23 years old and had lived in Briar Glen his entire life without ever seeing a tornado touch down. He looked out the window, looked back at Rachel, and did that thing young people do when they're deciding whether to take something seriously. "The sirens haven't gone off," he said. "I know. Shouldn't we wait for Danny?" Her voice was quiet and absolute. "Go to the cellar. Take the first aid kit under the prep counter and the 2 emergency lanterns on the shelf above the mop closet. Go now and leave the door open behind you." He went. Rachel turned back to the window, and that's when she saw them. They came over the hill on Highway 17 in a long thundering column chrome and leather and engine roar. 79 motorcycles riding 2 abreast, their formation beginning to break apart in the wind. She could see riders fighting their handlebars. She could see one bike drift hard to the shoulder and the rider correct with both hands. She could see in the far distance behind them, behind the hill they just crested, above the dark tree line, against that sick green sky, a funnel, not forming, already formed, already moving. It was pale gray at the top and dark as charcoal at the base, and it was traveling northeast at what her dispatcher training told her was somewhere between 40 and 60 miles per hour, which meant it was going to cross Highway 17 in roughly 3 to 4 minutes, and the column of motorcycles was directly in its path. Rachel didn't think about it. Later, she would try to reconstruct the exact moment she made the decision, and she genuinely couldn't find it. There was no moment of courage, no swelling of resolve, no internal voice saying, "This is what you were made for." There was just the funnel, and the riders, and the distance between them, and her legs already moving before her brain had completed a single coherent sentence. She grabbed the red tablecloth off the nearest table, the closest, brightest thing in reach, and she ran out the front door. The wind hit her like a wall. She staggered, caught her balance on the porch railing. and kept moving. Her hair tore loose from its tie. Her apron snapped sideways. The tablecloth tried to become a sail, tried to pull her off her feet, and she wrapped two fists around it and ran harder, out of the parking lot, past her truck, onto the asphalt shoulder of Highway 17. The lead riders saw her first. She could see the exact moment it happened. The front pair of bikes, a big Road King and a wide glide running side by side. And she watched the rider on the Road King spot her, watched his head come up, watched him ease back on the throttle. The rider behind him had to brake hard. The man behind that one swerved. Rachel was in the road now, in the middle of the lane, waving the tablecloth in wide arcs over her head and screaming as loud as she had ever screamed in her life. Tornado coming. Leave the bikes. Get underground. Leave the bikes and follow me now. The lead rider pulled to a stop 15 feet from her. He was big in the way that means years of physical work, not gym membership, with a gray streaked beard and a road-worn cut that said Hell's Angels across the back. He had his visor up, and he was staring at her with an expression that was neither angry nor afraid. He was reading her the way experienced people read emergency situations fast, without sentiment, looking for the information that matters. He looked at her face. He looked at her hands on the tablecloth. He looked at the sky behind her. Then he turned around on his bike and looked at the sky behind him. The funnel was visible now from the road. Anyone looking south could see it. He didn't say a word. He put two fingers in his mouth and whistled a sharp, carrying sound that cut through the engine noise and the wind, and made a sweeping downward motion with his whole arm. The signal moved back through the column like a wave. Engines began cutting out. Riders were pulling to the shoulder, kickstands going down, helmets coming off. Rachel was already moving. She turned and ran back toward the cafe and didn't look to see if anyone was following. She had to trust that they were. This way, she shouted over her shoulder. Around the back. There's a cellar, concrete walls. Reinforced door, just keep moving, don't stop. She heard boots on asphalt behind her. A lot of boots. She cut around the side of the cafe, past the dumpsters, past the stack of crates she'd been meaning to break down for recycling, to the back of the property where the old railroad freight depot had stood before she was born. The building itself was long gone, but the underground produce cellar beneath it had been built to last 8-inch concrete walls. A heavy steel reinforced door set flush with the ground, designed in 1947 to keep a harvest cold through a Kansas summer, and, her father had always said, to survive anything short of a direct strike. Rachel had the key on her personal key ring. Her hands were shaking not from fear, she would insist later, but from adrenaline and cold, and she missed the lock on the first try. The second try, the key turned, the heavy door swung up, and the smell of cool earth and concrete and old wood came up from below. Single file, she shouted, because the first riders were already reaching her, and she could see the chaos that was about to happen if she didn't give them structure. Single file. Strongest riders help anyone who's injured, children and elderly first. Wait, do you have any injured? The man with the gray beard was right behind her. Cole, she would learn later. Cole Maddox. 2 riders took falls on the curve when the wind hit, he said. His voice was level. He'd shifted into the same mode she was in, not calm exactly, but operational. One possible broken wrist. One's shaken up but moving. Get them to the front of the line. Get them down first. She turned to the entrance and started counting riders as they passed, touching each shoulder lightly, not out of warmth but out of necessity, so she could maintain the count. Go, watch the stairs. 14 steps, keep moving to the back. Will all 79 fit? Cole asked. They'll fit, she said, with more certainty than she actually felt. It was tight. It was very tight. The cellar was built wide enough to store commercial produce crates, not wide enough to hold nearly 80 full-grown adults in riding gear. But Rachel had done disaster training. She knew that in a genuine emergency, the space that exists is always the space that has to be enough. She directed the flow bigger riders toward the far wall, making room at the center, helmets stacked to one side, jackets used as cushioning and padding against the cold concrete. She found the rider with the wrist injury, a compact woman named Lena with short dark hair, and her jaw set hard against the pain, and got her seated with her arm elevated against a leather jacket. "Can you wiggle your fingers?" Rachel asked. Lena wiggled them. "Yeah." "Good. Keep it elevated. Don't move it." Rachel looked around. "Does anyone have a first aid kit?" "Mine is already down here." But 3 hands went up. 3 separate kit bags came down from 3 separate saddlebags that riders had thought to grab. Rachel almost laughed. She didn't. She took the bags, opened the best-stocked one, and started working. The man who was shaken up Wade, a younger rider with a long scar along his jaw and eyes that were moving too fast, touching everything and settling nowhere, was sitting against the near wall with his knees pulled up. Rachel recognized the signs immediately. She'd seen it in dispatch. She'd seen it in the field during a flash flood response 4 years ago. Wade was beginning to panic, and in an enclosed space with 78 other people, that was a problem she needed to address right now. She crouched in front of him, not over him, in front of him, at his level. She waited until his eyes found hers. "What's your name?" she said. "Wade, I'm Rachel. This cellar has been here since 1947. The walls are 8 inches of reinforced concrete. You are going to be fine. How many people are up there?" He meant riders outside. "Everyone is in," she said. Because they were Cole had just come down last, pulling the heavy door shut above him. The latch engaged with a sound like a vault closing. Everyone made it. Wade's breathing was fast and shallow. "I can't, it's small." "Look at me," she said, not at the walls. "At me." She held his gaze until his eyes steadied. "Can you count to 4 with me? In through the nose, for 4 counts. Just 4 counts." He tried it. His shoulders dropped a fraction. "Good," she said. "Keep going. 4 in, 4 out. I'm going to check on some folks, and I'll be right back." "You are fine." "Everyone in here is fine." She stood, turned, and nearly walked into Cole Maddox. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, not quite respect, not quite surprise. Something between the two that hadn't fully resolved into either. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. "Emergency dispatch, 6 years," she moved past him. "Excuse me, I need to check the door seal." The sound reached them before she got to the door. It started as a low vibration, not exactly sound, more like pressure, the kind of thing you feel in your sternum and your back teeth before your ears catch it. Then it built, fast. The way a locomotive builds when you're standing too close to the track, except there was nothing directional about it. It was coming from everywhere at once, from above and below, and through the walls themselves. The cellar shook. Not dramatically, not like a movie. It shook the way a building shakes when a heavy truck passes on the street outside. Except the truck didn't pass, it just kept going, kept pressing, kept building, and the emergency lanterns swung on their hooks, and someone near the back made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and Rachel stood in the center of that concrete room with 79 strangers and held absolutely still. She found that when she held still, other people held still too. The lanterns swung. Dust came down from the ceiling seams. The pressure in her ears built until she had to swallow hard to equalize it, and she heard at least a dozen other people doing the same thing around her. The roar outside peaked. She would later try to describe it to people who asked, and the closest she came was standing inside a car wash while someone ran a leaf blower directly against your window. Except the car wash is the size of the world, and the leaf blower is a freight train. And then it began to ease. Not all at once, gradually. The pressure releasing, the roar receding, the lanterns slowing their swing. Someone in the back started crying, not hysterically, just quietly, the kind of crying that happens when the body decides the emergency is over before the brain catches up. "Is everyone all right?" Rachel's voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Can you each tell your neighbors to check in? Tell me if anyone needs help." Voices moved through the cellar in a wave. "I'm okay. Fine here." "Yeah, who's got the wrist? Is she okay?" That last question came from 3 different directions at once. "Wrist is fine," Lena called out, with a slight edge that made several people near her laugh, and the laughter was the best sound Rachel had heard all day. Cole was at the door. I'll check. Wait 30 seconds, Rachel said. Tornadoes can double back. Give it 30 seconds. He gave it 30 seconds. Then he pushed the door up, and pale gray light flooded in, and the smell of broken wood and fresh earth and something electrical, like a storm-cleared sky, came down into the cellar with it, and Rachel followed him up the stairs into what remained of the afternoon. She stood in her back lot and looked at what the tornado had left behind. Her pickup truck was on its side in the ditch at the edge of the property. The cafe's roof, the north section, the section she'd been planning to resurface next spring, was partially gone. The decking exposed and splintered, insulation scattered across the parking lot in pink tufts. The tree line along the back fence had been sheared at shoulder height, the trunks standing like broken pencils. Across the field that bordered the highway, Harley-Davidson motorcycles lay scattered like leaves after a rain. 40, maybe 50 bikes on their sides, some further apart than seemed physically possible, some resting against each other at strange angles, chrome catching what little light remained in the sky. Rachel stood there and counted. Riders were emerging from the cellar behind her, 2 and 3 at a time, blinking in the flat gray light, looking at the field, looking at bikes, looking at each other. No one said anything for a long moment. Then Cole Maddox walked up beside Rachel and stood there with her, looking at the field, and said, in a voice that was not particularly dramatic, just honest, "All 79 of us are standing up right now." "Yes," she said. "Because of you." "Because of this cellar," she corrected. "My father built it well." Cole was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her sideways, not rudely, just the way people look at something they're trying to understand correctly. "You ran into the middle of the highway," he said, "into the wind, waving a tablecloth." "The tablecloth was red," she said. "It was the most visible thing I had." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if he'd let it. "Most people in this town locked their doors when they saw us coming." Rachel turned and looked at the cafe, her parents' cafe, with its wounded roof and its parking lot, full of pink insulation, and she felt something move through her that was not quite sadness and not quite grief and not quite the thing she'd been holding back since she ran out the front door, but was some compressed combination of all three. "Most people," she said, "didn't have a cellar." She turned back to the field. 2 riders were already moving through the scattered motorcycles, checking each one. A woman in riding boots was picking up a helmet that landed against the fence post, turning it over in her hands. A man with arm tattoos was on his phone, talking fast and low, his other hand rubbing the back of his neck. She looked at Wade. He was standing near the cellar entrance, breathing the open air, both hands loose at his sides. When he felt her looking, he met her eyes and gave her a single, deliberate nod. Thank you was in that nod, and something else too, something that had to do with not being left alone in the small dark space with his fear. She nodded back. Then she turned to what was left of her cafe and started making a list in her head. What was damaged? What was salvageable? What needed to happen in the next 2 hours to keep people safe and fed and accounted for? There would be time later to be scared. There would be time later to be sad about the truck and the roof and the spring repairs that were now going to be something much larger and more expensive than she'd budgeted for. There would be time later to sit in the kitchen and breathe. Right now, there were 79 people in her parking lot who needed to call their families, find out if their homes were intact, get warm, and assess injuries. And 2 of those people, Lena's wrist and a rider near the back of the cellar who'd taken a piece of falling debris across the shoulder, needed more than the first aid kit she had. Rachel walked to the nearest rider, who was standing, still a big man, with a shaved head and a bruise forming along his temple. "Do you have medical training?" she asked. He looked surprised. "Some. Army medic, 2 deployments. Good. Come with me. I need a second pair of hands." He followed her without asking why. That was the moment, though she didn't mark it as such at the time, when the afternoon began its quiet turn from catastrophe to something else. The riders who were standing began to move, and the ones who were moving began to organize themselves, and the organization happened naturally, not because anyone ordered it, But because these were people who understood systems, who'd ridden together long enough to know what it meant when one person saw something that needed doing and started doing it. Cole was directing traffic near the highway, waving away the first slow-moving cars from town that had come to see what the tornado had left behind. Lena, wrist braced with a wrap from the kit, and her pain compressed into a narrow expression, had found Rachel's notepad and was writing down names and injury status, moving through the group methodically. Wade had found the cafe's spare propane burner in the storage shed still standing, blessedly, and was reading the side of a coffee can, figuring out the ratio. Rachel watched all of this and felt, beneath the fear and the adrenaline and the cost calculations running in the back of her mind, something settled into place, a kind of rightness that had nothing to do with the tornado or the damage or the strangers in her parking lot. It had to do with the door in the ground behind her and the man who had built it 50 years before she was born, and the choice he'd made to build it strong enough for whatever might come. She thought, "Dad, I hope I did okay." Then she went inside to see what was left of her kitchen and whether she could get the gas line working and how much she had in the pantry and whether 79 people had eaten since before they hit the crosswind on Highway 17. Because there were 79 people in her parking lot, and Rachel Monroe, daughter of Preston Monroe, granddaughter of this cafe and this land and this stubborn stretch of Kansas ground, did not let people go hungry, not today, not in this storm, not ever if she had anything to say about it. Outside, in the flattened field where their Harleys lay on their sides, the riders of the Hells Angels were already moving toward the cafe. Not because anyone invited them, because some things don't require an invitation. The afternoon was not over. The worst of what was coming for Briar Glen, not from the sky, but from the men who'd been watching the storm from their office windows, calculating how much a disaster was worth that was still ahead. But right now, in this moment, the ground was still. The cellar door was open. The coffee was almost ready, and all 79 were standing. The coffee was bad. Rachel knew it was bad. She'd made it on a camp stove with grounds that had been sitting in the pantry since February. Using water from the emergency jugs she kept under the prep counter, and the result was something that was technically coffee the way a parking lot was technically a garden. But she handed it out in mismatched mugs and paper cups and one ceramic bowl she couldn't explain the presence of, and not a single one of the 79 riders who took a cup complained. They wrapped both hands around whatever she gave them and drank it like it was the best thing they'd ever tasted. And maybe in that moment it was. That was the first thing that surprised her about them. The second thing was how fast they moved. She didn't know what she'd expected. She'd grown up in Briar Glen. She'd heard the same stories everyone heard. She'd seen the way Danny had looked at her when she told him to go to the cellar, the unspoken question in his face. Are you sure you want to be the person who helps them? She hadn't consciously shared that hesitation, but she'd lived in this town long enough for it to have settled somewhere in the back of her thinking, quiet and unexamined the way assumptions do. What she hadn't expected was for Cole Maddox to finish his coffee in 2 swallows, set the cup on her prep counter, and say, "What do you need first, the roof or the road?" She stared at him. "I'm sorry. Your roof is open on the north side. That's the first priority if there's more weather coming." He glanced at the window. "Road in front is blocked with debris. Ambulances are going to need access to get through town. Which one first?" Rachel opened her mouth, closed it, and made a decision. "Road," she said. "People need the ambulances more than I need a dry ceiling tonight." He nodded once, turned around, and within 60 seconds, she heard the sound of motorcycles being righted in the field and men calling to each other in the flat. Purposeful shorthand of people who do physical work together and have done it for years. That was the moment the afternoon stopped being a disaster and became something else. She couldn't have named it yet. She just felt the shift, the way you feel a door opening in a dark room before you can see the light. Danny appeared at her elbow, wide-eyed and flour-dusted, with the expression of a man who had gone to the cellar expecting to wait out a storm, and had emerged to find his entire understanding of the afternoon rearranged. "There are guys out front with a chainsaw," he said. "I know. And somebody's on your roof." "Rachel, there are Hell's Angels on your roof." "Danny." She handed him a can of soup. "Find the big pot. We're feeding people." He took the can, looked at it, looked at her, and then did something she'd always respected about him. He stopped asking questions and went to find the pot. The next 2 hours moved in the way that real emergencies move, not like movies, not with a score underneath them and clean dramatic beats, but in overlapping waves of small urgencies that kept folding into each other before any one of them was fully resolved. Rachel was simultaneously directing the improvised first aid station she'd set up in the surviving half of the cafe dining room, managing the limited propane supply for the camp stoves, fielding questions from 2 different riders about whether the cafe's well pump ran on electricity or whether they could get water pressure back, and trying to keep track of which of her mismatched dishes had gone out to the parking lot and which ones were coming back. Lena had taken over the first aid station with one good hand and the methodical focus of someone who'd done clinical work before. Rachel had asked her at one point what she did for work. "I was an ER charge nurse for 9 years, Lena said, wrapping a compression bandage around a rider's knee with her uninjured hand while Rachel held the roll. "Retired 3 years ago. I mostly do this." She nodded toward the cafe window, toward where the riders were working on the road. "You retired to ride motorcycles?" "My husband retired to golf. I thought motorcycles seemed more honest." She pulled the bandage tight, secured it, looked at her patient. "Does that feel stable?" "Yeah," the rider said. He looked to be about 60, with the hands of someone who'd worked in metal his whole life. Yeah. Thank you. Don't put weight on it until you've had it looked at properly," Lena said. "And I mean a doctor, not one of your people telling you it looks fine." "We have a couple of doctors," he said, with a slight defensive edge. "Good." She turned to Rachel. "Who's next?" That was how it went. Lena treating and Rachel assisting and Danny feeding and Cole directing and Wade, who had counted his breaths in the dark cellar and nodded his thank you from the doorway. Wade had somehow become the person who knew where everything was, who was carrying supplies to the right person at the right moment, who appeared at Rachel's elbow with the thing she was about to ask for before she asked for it. She caught him at one point, handed him a cup of the terrible coffee, and said, "How are you doing?" He looked at her directly, which she'd noticed he hadn't been doing much in the cellar. "Better," he said. "Tighter spaces are harder for me." This he gestured toward the open lot, the broken sky. "The purposeful movement of people, this is easier. You don't have to explain it." "I know." He drank the coffee. "But I want to. Because you didn't make me feel like I was a problem in there. You just talked to me like I was a person who needed something specific for a few minutes, and then you moved on. That's people usually don't do that." Rachel looked at him for a moment. She thought about what it would have taken, what kind of accumulated experience, to make that sentence the thing worth saying. "People should," she said. "Yeah," he said. "They should." He handed her the empty cup and went back to work. By the time the first ambulances rolled through the cleared road, 45 minutes after the tornado passed. Not bad for a debris field that had blocked both lanes. The parking lot of the Prairie Lantern Cafe had become something that didn't have a clean name. It was a rescue station, a repair depot, a kitchen, and a gathering point all at once, organized without anyone formally organizing it, run without anyone formally running it, fueled by bad coffee and cold soup and the particular energy that comes when people who are good at doing things find other people who need things done. The EMTs who came through stopped when they reached the cafe. One of them, a young woman named Tara, who Rachel recognized from the dispatch days, climbed out of the ambulance and stood in the parking lot for a full 10 seconds. "Just looking, Rachel," she said finally. "How?" 79 extra sets of hands, Rachel said. Tara looked at the riders, at the big man, with the shaved head who was helping an elderly couple from a damaged house 3 blocks down, at the pair of bikers who were stringing emergency lights from their bikes to illuminate the intersection where the streetlights had failed, at the woman in riding boots who was carrying a toddler on her hip while the toddler's mother walked beside her with a crutch made from a piece of broken fence post. Tara looked at all of that, and then she looked at Rachel. "I had them wrong," she said quietly. "Most people did," Rachel said. That was the first twist in what Rachel had assumed was already over the realization that the riders were not a problem she had managed, but a force she had inadvertently mobilized. What had started as 79 people taking shelter in her cellar had become, within 2 hours, the primary search and rescue operation functioning in the damaged district of Briar Glen. Because the official emergency resources were stretched across multiple impact zones, and the riders had gotten to the nearest neighborhood before anyone else had clearance to enter. The town's reaction was not uniform. It was never going to be uniform. Some of the residents who'd locked their doors came outside and came down to the cafe and said thank you to people who didn't ask for it. Others watched from their porches without coming closer. A woman in a housecoat at the end of the block shouted something Rachel didn't catch, and a rider nearby turned and said something back that she also didn't catch. And nothing escalated, which she counted as a small separate victory. But then there was Frank Dellinger, who ran the hardware store on the north end of Main Street and had been a fixture of the town council for as long as Rachel could remember. And Frank walked up to Cole Maddox in Rachel's parking lot and said, with the particular brand of small-town authority that mistakes familiarity for power, "I need to ask you people to move your bikes off the shoulder. Fire marshal says it's a hazard." Cole looked at him. He didn't look angry, which was the thing that Rachel noticed. He looked like a man making a quick and private calculation about what this moment required. "Which bikes would those be?" Cole said. "The ones on the shoulder of Highway 17. "The ones that are there," Cole said, still in the same measured tone, "because a tornado put them there?" Frank's jaw tightened. "I'm not disputing the circumstances. I'm conveying the fire marshal's request. We've got 2 teams in the field right now helping your fire marshal's people move debris on Jefferson Street," Cole said. "We'll get to the bikes as soon as those folks are clear." "That a problem?" Frank looked at him for a moment. Then he looked around the parking lot at the lights, at the organized supply distribution, at the people moving with purpose. He looked at the cafe, where through the window he could see Danny serving soup and Lena triaging at the first aid table. He said, "I'll tell him 30 minutes. 20, Cole said. "We work fast." Frank Dellinger walked away, and Rachel, who had been close enough to hear the whole exchange, looked at Cole and said nothing. He glanced at her sideways. "Too much?" "No," she said. "That was exactly enough." The bikes on the shoulder were cleared in 18 minutes. Rachel knew because she timed it without meaning to. The second wave of surprise, the twist she hadn't seen coming, even as she stood in the middle of it, came when Cole found her in the cafe kitchen an hour later, where she was doing math on the back of an order slip that didn't add up the way she needed it to. Roof repair, insurance deductible, replacement cost for the truck, labor for the kitchen equipment that had shifted on its mounts when the ceiling section came down. Numbers that were large in a way that made her chest tight. Cole set an envelope on the counter next to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Don't," he said, before she could speak. "It's not charity. It's insurance. Our road captain carries emergency funds for exactly this kind of situation. Mechanical failures, accidents, unexpected damage. This qualifies." Rachel picked up the envelope. Set it back down. "Cole, Rachel, your bikes are in a field. Our bikes are insured," he said. "Are you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "But the deductible is what the envelope is for," he said. "That's all it is. It's not a gift. It's not obligation. Consider it the administrative fee for emergency cellar rental, invoiced at market rate for saving 79 lives." She looked at him. He looked back at her, entirely serious. "That's a terrible analogy," she said. "I know. But are you going to take it?" She took it. She told herself she'd figure out later how she felt about it. She put it in her apron pocket and went back to her list. And Cole went back outside, and that was that, except that it wasn't, because she could feel the weight of it in her pocket for the rest of the afternoon. Not heavy, just present, The way a stone in your pocket is always there, even when you're not thinking about it. The riders began leaving in stages as the afternoon turned toward evening. Not all at once, the ones who'd come the furthest first, needing to make time before dark, and the ones who'd stayed to help with specific jobs, finished those jobs before they left, which meant some of them were there until the streetlights came on and the temperature dropped and the parking lot was quiet again. Before Cole left, he came to find Rachel one more time. She was on the porch of the cafe, sitting on the top step with a mug of coffee that was actually decent. This time, she'd found a fresh bag in the back of the pantry, and she was looking at the field where the motorcycles had been. Most of them were upright now, or loaded into the truck beds that several riders had arranged for transport. A few were too damaged to move without a trailer, and they'd been secured and tagged for pickup. Cole sat down on the step beside her without asking. She didn't mind. He reached into his cut and pulled out something small, a brass bell, maybe 2 inches long, with a narrow ring at the top. He held it out. "Road bell," he said. "We give them to people who—" He stopped. Started again. "There's a tradition. When someone does something for the Road family, something that matters." He turned it over in his fingers. "They're usually given rider to rider. But the tradition doesn't actually say anything about that. The tradition just says you give it to someone who saved your people." Rachel took the bell. It was heavier than it looked. She turned it over and saw that the back had been engraved Hell's Angels, and beneath that, a number 79. "What does it mean to have it?" she asked. "It means," Cole said carefully, "that if you ever ring it actually or metaphorically, there are 79 people who come. No questions. No conditions." He looked at her. "You gave us a door when every other door was closed. That's not something we forget." Rachel held the bell in her palm and looked at it. She thought about saying it was too much. She thought about saying she didn't need it, which was the true thing she always reached for when people offered her things she hadn't earned by her own accounting. She thought about the envelope in her apron pocket and the coffee she'd made from Bad Grounds and the list of numbers on the back of the order slip. She closed her hand around the bell. "Thank you," she said. Cole nodded, stood up, looked at the cafe, at the exposed decking on the north roof, at the insurance company tape she'd put across the kitchen equipment, at the hand-lettered open sign in the window that she'd put back up at 4 o'clock because she'd made a decision, sometime around the 3rd ambulance run, that the cafe was going to stay open as long as people needed somewhere to come. "You're going to be okay," he said. Not as a promise, not as a guarantee, as an assessment. The way a person says it when they've read you clearly and they believe what they're saying. "I know," Rachel said, and then they were gone. The sound of the motorcycles faded south down Highway 17, and the parking lot was quiet, and Danny came out and sat on the step below her, and they both looked at for a while without saying anything. "Well," Danny said finally. "Yeah," Rachel said. Yeah, he looked at her. "You okay?" She thought about it. Her truck was in a ditch. Her roof had a hole in it. She had an envelope in her apron pocket and a brass bell in her hand and 79 names she hadn't gotten before they left, which she was already regretting, and a list of numbers on the back of an order slip that still didn't add up. "I'm going to be okay," she said. She meant it. She just didn't know yet what it was going to cost her to stay that way. Because the next morning, when she arrived at the cafe before sunrise to start assessing the damage properly, there was a county vehicle parked in her lot. A man in a suit was standing at her door with a clipboard and a laminated badge. And behind him, barely visible in the early gray light, was a second car she didn't recognize, a large black sedan with a company logo on the door. She couldn't read from where she stood, but that made something cold move through her before she knew why. She stood at the edge of her own parking lot and looked at those two cars and felt the brass bell shift in her pocket. And for the first time since she'd run into the road, waving a tablecloth at 79 motorcycles, she was genuinely, quietly afraid, not of what had already happened, of what was about to. The man with the clipboard saw her and smiled. It was the kind of smile she'd learned to recognize over years of running a small business in a small town, not warmth, not friendliness, but the performance of both, The kind of smile that has paperwork behind it and is waiting to see whether you'll be reasonable. Miss Monroe, he said. I'm Deputy Inspector Hale from the County Building Office. We've received notification that this property may have sustained structural damage that poses a public safety concern. He held up the clipboard. I'm here to conduct an assessment and determine whether a temporary closure order is warranted. Rachel looked at him. She looked at the black sedan. She thought about the fact that the tornado had happened yesterday afternoon, and this man was in her parking lot before the sun was fully up. Who notified you? She asked. He smiled again. The county receives automated reports from emergency dispatch when structural damage is logged at a given address. And the car behind you? He glanced back, briefly, as though he'd forgotten it was there. That's a representative from Voss Regional Logistics. They have an interest in the infrastructure assessment along the Highway 17 corridor. Rachel stood very still. She knew the name Voss Regional Logistics. Everyone in Briarglen did. Grant Voss had been trying to buy property along the highway for 2 years quietly, through intermediaries, always with the same pitch. Fair market value, economic development, good for the tax base. Her father had talked about it at the kitchen table the year before he got sick. He'd talked about it with the careful, controlled anger of a man who knew he was being played but couldn't yet prove it. She looked at the county vehicle. She looked at the black sedan. She thought about the fact that yesterday afternoon, the tornado sirens had not sounded. Not before the storm hit, not during, not after, until it was already on the ground and moving, and she was already in the road with the tablecloth. She had assumed it was equipment failure, an oversight, a terrible, random coincidence. Standing in her parking lot in the pre-dawn cold with the county inspector's paperwork and a Voss Company car parked 20 feet from her door, she started to wonder whether she had assumed wrong. I'll want to see your credentials, she said, and the specific statute under which you're authorized to issue a closure order. And I'd like the name of the structural engineer who will be conducting the assessment, because any closure order based on an assessment by an unqualified inspector won't hold in front of a judge. The inspector's smile stayed exactly where it was. Of course, Miss Monroe. We have everything in order. Good, Rachel said. She walked past him to her door, unlocked it, and went inside. She put the kettle on. She sat down at her kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. She started writing down everything she could remember about the day before the timeline, the siren, the shelter, the riders, the recovery operation, the 2 cars in the parking lot this morning, and the time she'd arrived, and the fact that no emergency services had contacted her, no insurance adjuster, no one from the county building office, before this man with his clipboard and his corporate backup had appeared in her lot. She wrote for 40 minutes before she heard the inspector's knock at the door. She wrote for 40 minutes, and by the end of it, what had started as a record of a storm had turned into something else. It had turned into a document, the kind her father had taught her to keep, the kind that mattered later when the people with clipboards and company cars and smiles that didn't reach their eyes tried to tell you what your own land was worth. She put the pen down. She picked up the brass bell from the table where she'd set it when she came in. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it down again, walked to the door, and opened it. Come in, Mr. Hale, she said. But I'm going to need you to show me that paperwork before we go any further. What was coming was bigger than a roof and a truck and a deductible. She didn't know yet exactly how big, but she was beginning to understand that the tornado had not been the storm she needed to survive. It had just been the beginning of one. Inspector Hale's paperwork was real. That was the first thing Rachel confirmed, sitting across from him at her kitchen table with the county codes manual. Her father had kept on the shelf above the refrigerator, the same shelf where he'd kept his emergency planning committee binders, his tax records going back 20 years, and a handwritten index of every document he'd ever filed with the county, cross-referenced by date and subject. Because Preston Monroe had been the kind of man who understood that paper was the only thing that stood between a person and whatever story someone more powerful wanted to tell about them. The paperwork was real. The inspection authority was legitimate. The statute Hale cited County Ordinance 14.7, Emergency Structural Assessment, following declared weather events existed exactly as he described it. But the timing was wrong, and Rachel had been in enough emergency situations to know that timing was never accidental. The tornado was declared at 4:47 p.m. yesterday, she said, reading from the legal pad where she'd recorded the timeline. The county's emergency declaration for the affected district wasn't filed until 6:15 p.m. Your notification to conduct assessments would have gone out after that. She looked up. It takes a minimum of 12 hours to process an assessment order through the building office. I know because my neighbor, Darlene Hutchins, went through this after the ice storm in 2019. She looked at the timestamp on Hale's authorization form. Your order is timestamped 11:58 p.m. last night. Hale kept his face neutral. He was good at that. Expedited processing is available for high-priority cases. Who flagged this as high priority? The county emergency coordinator. Who is? A slight pause. Deputy Coordinator Sims. Who works under Sheriff Price? Another pause. Shorter, more controlled. Sheriff Price oversees the emergency coordination office. Yes. Rachel wrote that down. She wrote down Sims's name, the timestamp, the statute number, and the phrase expedited processing. She underlined the last one. The man from the black sedan had not come inside. He was still in the parking lot, and Rachel had watched him. In the brief moment before she'd sat down with Hale, make 2 phone calls in quick succession, both of them short. She'd watched his body language, the way he turned away from the cafe windows when he made the calls, the way his shoulders set differently after the second one. She knew what that looked like. She'd seen it in dispatch when something was happening that the caller didn't want monitored. Mr. Hale, she said, setting her pen down and folding her hands on the table. I'm going to be cooperative with this inspection. I want you to know that. I have nothing to hide about this property, and I believe in the process. She paused, but I'm also going to be recording this assessment from the moment we step outside. I'm going to be documenting every finding, every measurement, and every comment you make. And I'm going to need the name and license number of any structural engineer whose conclusions you intend to use to support a closure order. Hale looked at her for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, not quite respect, but the recalibration that happens when someone realizes the person across the table is not going to be what they expected. That's your right, he said. I know it is, Rachel said pleasantly. More coffee. The assessment took 2 hours. Rachel followed Hale through every inch of the property, phone out, recording steadily, asking clarifying questions about every notation he made. She asked him to read each measurement aloud before writing it down. She asked him to confirm, on camera, that he was not a licensed structural engineer. She asked him to identify which specific findings, if any, he believed constituted an immediate safety hazard requiring emergency closure, as opposed to damage requiring repair within a standard remediation timeline. By the end, Hale's notations were significantly more careful than they'd probably been intended to be. He left without issuing a closure order. He said the findings would be reviewed by the building office and she'd receive formal notification within 5 business days. Rachel stood in her parking lot and watched both cars leave. Then she went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and called her father's old attorney, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who'd handled the cafe's incorporation paperwork 9 years ago, and who Rachel had always kept in her phone for reasons she'd never fully articulated to herself, but was now deeply grateful for. Patricia answered on the second ring. Rachel told her about the inspection, the timing, the Voss company car, the sheriff's coordination office, all of it. She heard Patricia get quiet in the particular way that lawyers get quiet when they're cataloging information. Forward me everything you recorded, Patricia said, and don't talk to anyone from the county or from Voss without me present. Not Hale, not whoever was in that sedan, not Price. A pause. Especially not Price. You know something about this already, Rachel said. It wasn't a question. Patricia was quiet for a moment. I know that Grant Voss has been quietly purchasing land along the Highway 17 corridor for 14 months. I know that 3 of those purchases happened within 30 days of various county inspections that found the properties to be in violation of updated commercial zoning codes. And I know that 2 of those property owners came to me afterward and told me they felt they'd had no choice but to sell. Another pause. I didn't have enough to do anything with it then. I might have something to work with now. Rachel sat with that for a moment. She thought about her father's kitchen table conversations. She thought about the sirens that hadn't sounded. She thought about the public shelter that had been closed for renovation. Renovation contracted to Voss's company, renovation that had apparently not progressed beyond the initial payment. She thought about 79 people in a concrete cellar beneath her backlot, breathing the same compressed air, waiting for a roar to pass. She said, "Patricia, where do I start?" "You start," Patricia said, "by going through every piece of paper your father ever kept." Rachel was already moving toward the shelf above the refrigerator before she finished the sentence. Preston Monroe had been meticulous. That was the word for it, not organized. Not careful, but meticulous in the way of a man who had decided at some point that the truth was a thing worth preserving in its exact form, without editorializing, without selection, without the small convenient omissions that make records easier to maintain and harder to use. He'd kept minutes from every emergency planning committee meeting he'd attended. He'd kept copies of every letter he'd sent and every response he'd received. He'd kept newspaper clippings, annotated in his small, precise handwriting. He'd kept Weather Service reports going back 15 years, filed by date and cross-referenced by event type, because Preston Monroe had lived through enough Kansas summers to know that the sky was a recurring character, not a one-time plot device. Rachel sat on the kitchen floor and went through the binders. She went through them systematically, the way her father had taught her, which meant starting at the beginning and not skipping ahead even when you thought you knew what you were looking for. Because the thing you needed was usually adjacent to the thing you thought you needed, not identical to it. The third binder. Emergency Planning Committee Correspondence, 2019 through 2023. Her father had stopped serving on the committee in March 2023, when his diagnosis made the meetings too difficult to attend regularly. The letter was dated November 14th, 2022. It was addressed to Sheriff Nolan Price, copied to the County Emergency Coordinator and the State Emergency Management Office. It was signed by Preston Monroe and 4 other committee members, and it said, in the careful, formal language that her father used when he was genuinely angry, "The committee has conducted a physical assessment of all county emergency sirens within the Briar Glen district and found that 3 of the 5 installed units have not received manufacturer-recommended maintenance in over 4 years. Unit 3, located on the Highway 17 corridor, has a documented sensor failure that has not been addressed despite 2 previous notifications. We are formally requesting that the county allocate emergency maintenance funding before the spring severe weather season." There was no response on file. Rachel set that letter aside and kept reading. 4 pages later, a second letter, dated March 8th, 2023. Same addressees. This one about the public storm shelter on Meridian Road, the official county shelter, the one that had been closed for renovation. The letter noted that the renovation contract had been awarded to Voss Regional Logistics Construction subsidiary 7 months prior, that no meaningful work had been completed during that period, that the shelter remained non-functional, and that the committee was formally requesting either an accelerated completion schedule or the designation of an alternative shelter site before storm season. No response on file to that one either. Rachel sat on the kitchen floor with both letters in her hands and felt something move through her that was not quite rage and not quite grief, but had the quality of both, the feeling of a door opening onto something you'd suspected was behind it, but hadn't let yourself fully believe until you were standing in front of the open space. Her father had known. He'd put it on paper. He'd sent it to the right people through the right channels. And the right people had not responded. And the wrong people, the people with company cars and clipboards and smiles that didn't reach their eyes, had been watching the corridor, watching the sirens, watching the shelter contract sit unfinished, waiting for a storm season that would do what 14 months of quiet purchasing couldn't quite accomplish. She called Patricia back. "I found them," she said. She heard Patricia go very still on the other end of the line. "Found what?" "Letters from my father. To Price, to the county coordinator, to the state emergency office. Two of them, one about the sirens, one about the shelter contract. Both before the tornado. Both on record." Neither answered. The silence on Patricia's end lasted 4 full seconds. "Rachel, I need you to scan those documents and send them to me in the next 10 minutes. And then I need you to make physical copies and put the originals somewhere that is not in that building." Patricia, "Somewhere that is not in that building," Patricia repeated, with a quiet firmness that Rachel understood immediately. "Because if those documents mean what I think they mean, there are going to be people who would prefer that they don't exist." Rachel stood up from the kitchen floor. "I understand." She scanned the letters on the cafe's ancient flatbed scanner, the one she used for receipts and invoices, the one that was slow and complained at every paper that wasn't perfect flat. She scanned them while they were still in her hands, uploaded the files to 3 separate places: her email, a cloud drive, and a folder she shared immediately with Patricia, and then she called Cole. He answered on the second ring. She could hear road noise in the background. He was already somewhere on the highway. "Hours south, Rachel." Something in her voice must have told him immediately, because he didn't ask how she was doing, didn't make small talk, just said her name and waited. She told him about Hale, about the Voss sedan, about the sirens and the shelter, and her father's letters, and Patricia's instructions. She told it fast, and in order, the way she'd learned to deliver dispatch information: no editorializing, no emotion, just sequence and fact, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. Cole was silent for a moment after she finished. Then, "Are you safe right now?" "I'm in the cafe." "Yes." "Are the documents secure?" "Copies are in 3 locations. Originals are I put them in my car." She paused. "My car is Danny's car. I borrowed it. The truck is still in the ditch." A brief silence. "Smart." Another pause. "Rachel, don't fight them physically. Whatever comes next, don't. Your power is on paper, not in the road." "I know." "Send every 2, he said. "She has contacts at the state level from her hospital work. People in the regulatory office she knows personally. Send her everything you sent Patricia." Rachel wrote down Lena's contact information as Cole gave it to her, and then she said, "Cole, the sirens didn't go off." "I know. They were scheduled for maintenance the day of the storm." "I heard that. And the public shelter was under a Voss contract." "I know. Rachel, my father wrote letters." "I know," he said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter. "Rachel, I know. And I need you to understand something. The thing that happened yesterday, you saving those 79 people, that wasn't just luck. It was competence and courage, and it happened because the systems that were supposed to work didn't work, and you stood in the gap. But the reason those systems didn't work is going to matter. That's what you're holding in your hand right now. That's what they're going to try to get away from you." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to let that happen." "I know you're not," he said. "But be careful, and call me if anything changes. Anything at all." She put the phone down and stood in the kitchen for exactly 30 seconds, letting herself feel the weight of what she was holding, not the documents themselves, not the physical paper, but the knowledge, the shape of what had been allowed to happen, and by whom and why. Then she opened her laptop and started making a list of every county official who had received one of her father's letters and had not responded. It was a longer list than she'd expected. 3 days passed. The cafe stayed open because closing it felt like conceding something Rachel wasn't ready to concede. Danny came in every morning. Lena called twice from the road with updates. She had spoken to a contact at the State Emergency Management Oversight Office, a woman named Dr. Yolanda Ferris, who had apparently been watching the Voss corridor situation with interest for some months, but had been waiting for something concrete to move on. Patricia filed a formal records request with the county for all communications related to the siren maintenance schedule and the Meridian Road shelter contract. The town moved around Rachel in the complicated way that small towns move around someone at the center of something, some people stopping to ask if she needed anything, some people crossing the street, some people asking questions with their eyes that they weren't quite ready to ask with their mouths. Frank Dellinger came in for coffee on the second day and sat at the counter and stirred his cup for a long time before he said, "I heard about the inspection." Rachel said. "And I heard Voss has been making calls." He kept his eyes on his cup. "To the Planning Commission, to the Zoning Board." A pause. "To Price." Rachel poured herself a coffee and leaned against the counter. "Frank, what do you know about the shelter contractor?" He was quiet for a moment. "I know it was awarded fast," he said. "Faster than normal process. And I know the timeline on completion has been flexible." He looked up at her. "I also know I've been on the Planning Commission for 11 years and I should have asked more questions and I didn't." Rachel looked at him. "Are you going to ask them now?" "I'm trying to figure out if it's too late." "It's not," she said. "But it might be soon." Frank Dellinger nodded slowly, finished his coffee, left a $5 bill on the counter that was twice what the coffee cost, and left without saying anything else. Rachel counted that as something. Not enough, but something. On the fourth night they came. It was 11:20 p.m. Rachel knew the time because she'd been awake, sitting at the kitchen table with the binders and her laptop, when she heard the sound of heavy equipment on the road. Not passing, slowing, stopping. She went to the window and looked out. 2 flatbed trucks, a county vehicle, a black sedan, the same one she was almost certain that had been in her lot 4 days ago, and a man in a hard hat standing at the edge of her property line with a clipboard and a flashlight. She called Patricia first. Patricia didn't answer. It was past 11, and Rachel left a tight, fast voicemail with the time and what she was seeing. She texted everything she'd just said in a follow-up message. Then she went outside. The man in the hard hat looked up when she came through the door. He was maybe 45, with the particular look of someone who does uncomfortable work and has made his peace with it. Behind him, a deputy she recognized, Garrett, who'd been with the department 8 years, who she'd seen at the cafe twice a week for most of those 8 years, stood with his thumbs in his belt and an expression that was trying very hard to be official. "Ms. Monroe." The man in the hard hat held out a document. "I'm with Harmon Contractors. We've been authorized by the county to conduct emergency stabilization work on the cellar structure behind your property. We have an emergency demolition order for the entrance structure, which has been assessed as..." "Stop," Rachel said. He stopped. "Let me see the order." He handed her the clipboard. She read it fast, because she'd spent 4 days reading county documents and she knew what she was looking for. Emergency demolition order, citing ordinance 14.7, signed by the deputy county engineer, countersigned by Sheriff Price. Structural assessment attached, conducted by an engineer named Thomas Breck. She looked up. When was this assessment conducted? The assessment was... The date on this document says the assessment was conducted on the 14th. That was 3 days ago. She looked at him steadily. Thomas Breck never came to this property. I have been here every day since the tornado, and I have a camera system that records the parking lot and the back access road, and I have reviewed that footage. And Thomas Breck was not on this property on the 14th. She let that land. So either this assessment was conducted remotely by an engineer who has never seen the structure he's condemning, or this signature is fraudulent. Either way, this order is invalid. The man in the hard hat looked at the clipboard. He looked at Deputy Garrett. He looked at the black sedan, where someone was sitting in the passenger seat with a phone to their ear. Garrett said, "Ms. Monroe, I need to ask you to step back and allow." "Garrett," Rachel said. And she used his first name, Mark, the way she'd been using it for 8 years over his Tuesday coffee and his Friday pie. The way you say someone's name when you want them to remember who you both are. "Mark. Do you know what this cellar is? Do you know what happened in there 4 days ago?" He was quiet. 79 people, she said. I need you to think about that. 79 people are alive because of the structure they are trying to tear down tonight. And the order authorizing them to do it was signed based on an assessment that didn't happen. I need you to think very carefully about whether you want to be the person who lets that go forward. Garrett's jaw tightened. He looked at the sedan. He looked back at Rachel. From inside the cafe, Rachel's phone was ringing. She didn't move to answer it. I'm not going to let you start that equipment until I speak to a judge, she said to the contractor. That is my right under this same ordinance you're citing. Subsection 14.7 requires property owner notification of no less than 48 hours before emergency demolition. Absent an imminent collapse hazard, the structure is not collapsing. It survived a direct tornado transit. You want to argue imminent collapse to a judge, you go ahead and call one. The man in the hard hat was very still. The door of the black sedan opened. The man who got out was Grant Voss. Rachel had seen him once before, at a town council meeting 2 years ago, when he'd presented his corridor development plan with a PowerPoint and a practiced smile and a firm handshake for everyone in the room. He was tall, well-dressed even at this hour, with the physical ease of a man who has rarely been told no in an environment where his money is visible. He walked toward her, with his hands slightly open, not aggressive. The practiced body language of negotiation, of I'm a reasonable man approaching an unreasonable situation. Miss Monroe, he said, I think there may be some misunderstanding here that we can resolve without Mr. Voss, Rachel said. I know about the letters. He kept walking for one more step. Then he stopped. My father wrote to Sheriff Price in November 2022 about the siren on the Highway 17 corridor. Unit 3, documented sensor failure. No maintenance. No response. She watched his face. He wrote again in March 2023 about the Meridian Road shelter. Your company's contract. No completion, no response. She took one step toward him. I know about the 14 months of property purchases. I know about the expedited inspection orders. And I know that the engineer whose name is on that demolition order was not on this property on the date listed. Voss looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower, the performance of reasonableness gone. You're making accusations you can't support. I'm describing documents I'm currently holding, she said. The accusations are the State Emergency Management Office's job. I've already sent them everything. From the road, a set of headlights was approaching. Then another. Then 2 more. Garrett turned to look. The contractor turned to look. Voss turned to look. 4 cars from town. Rachel recognized them even in the dark because she'd been seeing them in her parking lot for 11 years. Frank Dellinger's pickup. Tara the EMT's personal car. The Hutchins family's minivan. A car she needed a moment to place before she recognized it as belonging to a man named Roy Sayers, who had lived 3 blocks from the cafe for 40 years and had never once, to Rachel's knowledge, left his house after 9 p.m. They parked in her lot, and they got out, and they stood there in the dark watching. Then phones came out, not to call, to record. Voss looked at the phones. He looked at the growing line of people. He looked at Rachel. She pulled her own phone from her pocket. I've been recording since I came outside, she said quietly. So has my camera system. And every document I have has been copied to 3 separate locations, 2 of them outside this county. She held his gaze. This order is invalid. This assessment is fraudulent. And everything happening in this parking lot right now is on record. She turned to the contractor. I'd advise you to wait for a judge's authorization before you start that equipment. That's not a threat. That's the law. The contractor looked at his clipboard. He looked at the cameras. He looked at Grant Voss. Voss said nothing. The contractor said, we'll need to pause pending clarification of the authorization. He got back in his truck. Rachel stood in her parking lot and did not move until both flatbeds and the county vehicle and the black sedan had backed out and gone. She stood there with her phone, still recording, and her father's letters copied to 3 different servers, and 79 names she'd finally gotten from Cole, and Frank Dellinger's pickup parked 20 feet behind her. When the last set of taillights disappeared down Highway 17, Roy Sayers walked up beside her. He was 73 years old, with a hearing aid and a cane, and the particular moral authority of a man who has decided, after a very long, quiet life, that some things are worth coming out after 9 p.m. for. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You need anything?" She thought about it. She was shaking. She'd been shaking since the sedan door opened. She just hadn't let herself feel it until now. Her throat was tight. The brass bell was in her pocket, and she pressed 2 fingers against it through the fabric without taking it out. "No," she said. "I think I've got what I need." But she knew, even as she said it, that what she had was evidence and witnesses, and a legal filing and a network of people who were paying attention. What she did not have was a resolution. What she did not have was an end. She was winning tonight's battle. She hadn't won the war. Not yet. She looked at the cellar door, set flush in the ground behind the cafe, solid and dark and still, the way her father had built it to be built to last, built to hold, built on the assumption that whatever came, the ground beneath it was worth defending. She squared her shoulders and went back inside. She had calls to make. And morning was not as far away as the dark made it seem. She didn't sleep. Rachel sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning with the legal pad, the binders, the laptop, and a mug of coffee that went cold twice before she remembered to drink it. She was writing everything down, not because she didn't have it documented already, but because the act of writing helped her think, helped her organize the shape of what she was dealing with into something her mind could hold without flinching. Her father had done the same thing. She'd watched him do it at this same table, in this same kitchen, with a similar legal pad and the same small, precise handwriting, working through whatever problem the cafe or the land or the town had presented that particular season. She wondered what he would say right now. She could hear his voice clearly enough. Preston Monroe had not been a man of many words, but the words he chose landed with the weight of things considered for a long time before being released. He would probably say something like, "You've got the paper, Rachel. Now you need the people." She already had some of the people. Frank Dellinger, who'd come out in the dark with his pickup and his 11 years of planning commission guilt. Tara, who'd been sending the video she'd recorded to her own network since she got home. Roy Sayers, who had called her from his car before he'd even pulled out of the parking lot to ask if she needed him to come back in the morning. Patricia, who had filed 4 separate records requests by midnight and was apparently the kind of lawyer who did her best work in the small hours. Lena, who had called at 1 a.m. from a motel 2 states over to say that Dr. Yolanda Ferris at the State Emergency Management Office had asked for every document Rachel could provide, and that Dr. Ferris had used the word urgent in a tone that Lena said she recognized from 9 years in the ER as meaning something was already moving. Cole had texted at midnight, "We're coming back." Rachel had stared at that text for a full minute before typing back, "You don't have to do that." He'd replied with 2 words, "We know." She hadn't texted again after that. She hadn't needed to. At 3:15 a.m., she closed the laptop, stacked the binders, and went to the back of the cafe to check the cellar door. She didn't know exactly why, maybe to reassure herself it was still there, still solid, still the thing her father had built it to be. She pushed on it with one hand, testing the weight of it, and it didn't move. 8 inches of reinforced concrete and a steel-hinged door, perfect Lasmels, built in 1947 by a man who believed doing things right the first time, because you couldn't always predict when right was going to matter. She pressed her palm flat against the cool surface. "Okay, Dad," she said quietly. "Okay." Then she went upstairs to the small apartment above the cafe where she'd lived her entire life, set her phone alarm for 6, and lay down on top of the covers with her clothes on. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She woke at 5:40 to the sound of her phone going off with a call, not the alarm. Patricia. "They withdrew the demolition order," Patricia said, without preamble. "Price called the county engineer's office at 11 p.m. last night after your parking lot situation and requested that it be pulled from active status toss pending legal review, which means they know it won't hold. Rachel sat up. That's good. It's better than good. It's evidence of consciousness of guilt, Patricia said, and Rachel could hear the legal precision behind that phrase, the way it would sound in a filing. I've also received confirmation that the county engineer's office has no record of Thomas Breck conducting a site assessment on your property. His license is real. His firm is real. But the assessment was either conducted remotely based on the post-tornado aerial survey data, or the signature was affixed without his direct involvement. A pause. I spoke to Breck this morning. He was not pleased. He's cooperating. He is filing his own complaint with the county by end of business today. Patricia's voice had the particular quality of a woman who had been awake as long as Rachel had and was running on the same fuel, the clean, focused energy of someone who has found the thread and is following it. Rachel, I need you to be ready for today to move fast. Dr. Ferris's office has been in contact with the State Attorney General's Division of Public Safety. They've been looking at the corridor property acquisitions from a different angle for 6 months, and your father's letters are there significant. They connect things. Rachel was already standing. What do I need to do? Keep the cafe open, Patricia said. Be visible. Be normal. Don't do anything that looks like you're bracing for a fight, because the fight is moving to a venue where your composure is more valuable than your confrontation. A pause. And Rachel, call me before you open that door to anyone today. Anyone. County, state, federal, pizza delivery. You call me first. Understood, Rachel said. She put the coffee on. She called Danny and told him to come in early. She stood at the window while the coffee brewed and watched the empty parking lot and the empty field where the motorcycles had lain scattered 9 days ago. And she felt the particular quality of a morning that is quiet because something is building, not because nothing is happening. She was on her second cup when Danny arrived, and on her third when Frank Dellinger pulled up in his pickup with a woman Rachel didn't recognize in the passenger seat, 60-something, wire-rimmed glasses, a canvas bag over one shoulder that said she was someone who carried documents everywhere she went. Frank brought her in and said, Rachel, this is Margaret Holloway. She was on the county emergency committee before your dad. Before Price reorganized the committee structure in 2021. Margaret Holloway shook Rachel's hand with a grip that said she'd been waiting for this meeting longer than Rachel had. Your father and I served together for 4 years, she said. He was the best documented person I've ever known. When Frank called me last night and told me what you'd found, she set the canvas bag on the table. I went through my own files. Rachel looked at the bag. What's in there? The responses, Margaret said. The letters your father sent didn't get responses because Price didn't respond through official channels. He responded through private email, in some cases through verbal communication, in committee meetings, which I documented in my own notes. She opened the bag and placed a folder on the table. He told your father and the committee twice, on record in my notes, that the siren maintenance was, quote, being handled through a separate facilities contract, and that the shelter renovation was on schedule. Both statements made in 2022. Both false. She met Rachel's eyes. I should have pushed harder. I've been sitting with that for 9 days. You're here now, Rachel said. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Your father was a good man. I know, Rachel said. Sit down. Let me get you some coffee. By 10 a.m., Patricia had incorporated Margaret's documentation into the filing. By noon, Dr. Ferris's office had formally requested all county communication records related to the siren maintenance contract and the Meridian Road shelter for the previous 3 years. By 2 p.m., Grant Voss's attorney had called Patricia to request a meeting, which Patricia declined in terms that Rachel found deeply satisfying when Patricia relayed them. And then, at 2:47 p.m., Rachel heard it. She was in the kitchen. The lunch rush had been steady, more people than usual. She noticed people coming in who didn't normally come in on weekdays, people sitting at tables and talking in the low, intent way that people talk when something is happening in a town and they want to be where the information is. She was plating a BLT when the sound reached her. Low, at first. A vibration more than a sound. The kind of thing that travels through the ground before it reaches the air. And for one suspended, terrible second, her whole body went rigid because it felt like the roar from the cellar, the pressure in her sternum, the freight train that wasn't a freight train. Then her brain caught up. It wasn't one engine, it was dozens. Then more. The pitch and rumble of motorcycles, multiple. Disciplined, not chaotic, not the crosswind scramble of 10 days ago, but something organized. Something deliberate. Something that grew as she listened from a distant hum to a present thunder. Danny appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face was doing something she'd never seen it do before. He looked stunned in the way that people look when reality exceeds their category for it. "Rachel," he said, "you need to come see this." She set down the plate and followed him to the front window. They were coming over the hill on Highway 17 in organized columns, two abreast, exactly as she'd seen them 10 days ago, except there had been 79 of them 10 days ago. And what she was looking at now was not 79. She counted instinctively, the way she'd counted riders going into the cellar, touching each shoulder. She got to 100 and kept going. The column stretched back over the hill and out of sight, chrome catching the afternoon sun, the sound building as they came closer until it was less a sound than a presence, a thing the air was made of. Danny said very quietly, "How many is that?" Rachel pressed one hand against the window glass. Her throat was tight. She thought about the road bell in her pocket. She thought about Cole's text at midnight, "We're coming back." She thought about what he'd said on her porch 9 days ago. "You gave us one door when every other door was closed." "I don't know yet," she said. She went outside. They were already pulling into the lot, onto the shoulder, into the field parking, in orderly rows, with the precision of people who'd ridden together long enough to move as a single organism. Engines cutting, kickstands dropping, helmets coming off, and underneath all of it, the low murmur of hundreds of people having dozens of conversations at once. The sound of arrival, of presence, of weight. Cole was in the lead. He pulled in first, cut his engine, and got off his bike in one motion, and he walked toward Rachel, without any particular ceremony, the way you walk towards someone you know. He was carrying something, a rectangle of red fabric, folded. He stopped in front of her and held it out. She took it, unfolded it. The red tablecloth, the one she'd grabbed off the nearest table 10 days ago, the one she'd waved over her head in the middle of Highway 17, while the wind tried to take it from her, had been laundered and pressed and laid flat. And across the white border, in signatures of every size and style, were 79 names. Some in marker, some in pen. Some so cramped they were almost illegible. Some written large and clear and deliberate. 79 signatures. All of them. Rachel stood in her parking lot, holding the tablecloth with both hands, and could not speak for a moment. "We got everyone to sign it before they left," Cole said. "Took a few phone calls to track down the last 6. But we got everyone." He paused. "We thought you should have it." She looked up at him. Her eyes were burning, and she let them. "Because some things are not worth fighting." "How many did you bring?" 390, he said. "Survivors and road family from 4 states. We've got licensed contractors, electricians, roofers, plumbers, a mobile kitchen, 2 registered nurses, a doctor, 3. A structural engineer who has already offered to assess your cellar at no cost and put his name on the findings. And," he stopped, and something shifted in his expression, something that wasn't quite a smile but had the warmth of one. "We've got Wade." Rachel looked past Cole. Wade was standing near the cellar entrance, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the door in the ground with the expression of a man who has decided that the way to beat a thing is to go back to it. He must have felt her looking, because he turned, and he did what he'd done in her parking lot 10 days ago. He met her eyes and gave her one deliberate nod. She nodded back. "Cole," she said, and her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when they're choosing to be. "What do we need to do first?" He looked at the cafe, the north roof section still exposed. The kitchen equipment still marked with her insurance tape. The parking lot still showing the scrape marks where the county flatbeds had parked 4 nights ago. He looked at the surrounding blocks, the damaged houses, the debris-cleared streets, The town that was still, in most of the ways that mattered, in the middle of something it hadn't finished surviving yet. Roof first, he said, so you can run the kitchen properly. Then the cellar reinforcement, so your structural engineer has something to certify. Then we fan out to the neighborhood. We've got lists from the emergency services coordinator. Tara sent them to us this morning of the households that need the most help and haven't had resources reach them yet. He paused. That going to work? That's going to work, Rachel said. What happened next in Briar Glen was the kind of thing that towns talk about for decades, not because it was dramatic in the cinematic sense, not because there was a single climactic moment that could be cut into a highlight, but because it was sustained. It was 390 people working from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. across an entire storm-damaged district, organized with a precision that the official emergency response hadn't matched in 10 days of trying. The mobile kitchen set up in Rachel's parking lot and fed everyone: riders, residents, emergency workers, anyone who walked up. No questions about who you were or what you believed or whether you'd been one of the people who'd locked your door 10 days ago. You were hungry, you ate. That was the entire policy. And it was enforced with the cheerful inflexibility of the retired Army cook named Big Carl, who ran the kitchen with the authority of a man who considers hunger a personal affront. Lena set up the medical station in the surviving half of the dining room, the same table Rachel had used for triage 10 days ago. And the line of residents who came in for wound checks and medication questions, and the accumulated small physical damage of 10 days of storm recovery was longer than Rachel would have predicted, and shorter than Lena seemed to think it should be. People wait too long, Lena told Rachel. Between patients, her wrist in a proper cast now, and her one good hand doing the work of two. They think they're being tough. They're just being undertreated. Sounds like something you'd say to your ER patients. I said it to my ER patients constantly. She looked at Rachel directly. I said it to myself until I had a cardiac event at 54, and my cardiologist said it to me from the other side of the bed. She turned to the next person in line. What are we looking at? On the roof, a crew of 8 riders worked with Rachel's contractor estimate in hand, not to patch, but to properly repair, pulling the damaged decking, replacing the substrate, laying new shingles, with the efficiency of people who'd done roof work before and weren't interested in doing it twice. The foreman came down at noon to ask Rachel about a section of flashing near the chimney that wasn't on the estimate, and when she said she didn't know if she could cover the additional cost right now, he looked at her for a moment and said, "Did I ask you about cost?" and went back up. She stood at the base of her own roof and watched a stranger fix her chimney, flashing, and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though it was that. It wasn't relief, though it was that too. It was something more specific, the feeling of being on the receiving end of something you'd spent your whole life being the provider of, and finding that it felt different from that side than you'd expected. Bigger, more vulnerable, harder to hold without shaking. Wade came to find her at 2 in the afternoon. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, real coffee, from the mobile kitchen's proper machine, not her February grounds on a camp stove, and he handed her one without asking if she wanted it, because by then everyone in the parking lot had figured out that Rachel Monroe was always ready for coffee. He stood beside her, and they both looked up at the roof for a moment. I went down in the cellar this morning, he said, before people got here. Just me. He drank his coffee. I wanted to see if I could do it. She waited. I stayed down there for about 10 minutes, he said. Counted my breaths the way you showed me. 4 in, 4 out. He looked at the cellar door. It was okay. Not comfortable, but okay. He paused. I told the structural engineer I'd help with the reinforcement work. He said he could use someone who could hold a level steady. Rachel looked at him. You doing the work for you or for the cellar? He thought about it honestly. Both, he said. Is that all right? That's exactly right, she said. The twist that Rachel hadn't anticipated, the one that arrived at 4 p.m. in the form of a state vehicle in her parking lot, and a woman in a gray blazer who introduced herself as Assistant Attorney General. Denise Chavez was not a twist toward more trouble. It was the other kind. The kind that hits you sideways when you've been braced for a blow. And what comes instead is something that feels like solid ground. Chavez had a folder. She shook Rachel's hand, shook Patricia's hand. Patricia had driven down from the city that morning and was working from a corner table in the cafe. And then she said, without sitting down, without small talk, we've executed a records hold on all county communications related to the maintenance contract and the Meridian Road shelter for the past 36 months. Sheriff Price has been placed on administrative suspension pending investigation. Grant Voss's county contracts have been frozen, and the state attorney general's office has opened a formal inquiry into the property acquisition timeline along the Highway 17 corridor. She looked at Rachel steadily. You're not going to receive any more middle-of-the-night demolition crews. Rachel stood very still. She heard Patricia make a short sound that was probably professional satisfaction, compressed into an exhale. The cellar, Rachel asked. Is not being touched, Chavez said. The structural engineer you have on site today, his assessment. If it certifies the structure, will be submitted to the county building office as grounds for formal designation as a community shelter. She paused. Your father's letters are part of the evidentiary record now. They matter. Rachel sat down. She hadn't realized she needed to until she was doing it. Dropping into the chair at the nearest table, with both hands around her coffee cup, the weight of 10 days of standing up coming down on her all at once, not as collapse, but as release, the specific, exhausted relief of a person who has been holding something heavy and has just been told they can set it down. Thank you, she said. Chavez looked at her. Thank your father, she said. He documented everything. Outside, the work continued. 390 riders in a tornado-damaged Kansas town, fixing what the storm had broken, and some of what had been broken before the storm. The mobile kitchen serving dinner as the sun dropped. The medical station wrapping up its last patients. The roof crew climbing down with the satisfied quiet of people who'd done what they came to do. Roy Sacher showed up at 5:30 with a casserole dish and the information that 6 of his neighbors had seen the motorcycles arrive and had initially locked their doors. He said 3 of those 6 had unlocked them by noon and come out to receive help with their damaged property. He said the other 3 were still inside, but that 2 of them had accepted a meal from the mobile kitchen through a cracked door, which he was counting as progress. Rachel counted it as progress too. Cole found her at 6, when the light was going gold and long across the parking lot, and the work was winding down to its finishing details. He sat on the porch step beside her, the same step they'd sat on 10 days ago. And they were quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet when they've been through something together, and the words for it haven't arrived yet. How's the roof? She asked finally. Solid, he said. Better than it was before the tornado, if you ask Mike. And Mike takes that as a personal challenge. The cellar? Wade and the engineer finished at 4. New drainage channel, reinforced hinges, interior emergency lighting. He's certifying it tomorrow morning. Rachel nodded. She looked at the tablecloth, which she'd brought out and draped over the porch railing, not to display it, just to keep it close, the way you keep something close that you can't quite find the right place for yet. Cole looked at it too. You know what I keep thinking about? He said. What? That the whole time we were in that cellar, the whole time that roar was going on, overhead you didn't make a single sound that suggested you were scared. He paused. I've ridden with a lot of people in a lot of conditions. I know what fear management looks like. And what you were doing was it was something else. He looked at her. Were you scared? Rachel thought about it. Honestly, when the pressure changed, she said, when my ears popped. For about 10 seconds, I was very scared. What did you do? I looked at the people around me, she said, and I decided that if I could hear them breathing, then the thing I needed to do was keep breathing too, loudly enough that they could hear it. She looked at the tablecloth. It's not courage. It's arithmetic. You subtract what you can't control, and you add what you can. Cole was quiet for a moment. Your father teach you that? He would have said it better, she said. But yes, he nodded. They sat with that for a moment. Then he said, 390 people drove a combined distance of I'm not even going to do that math to be here today. Because 79 of them are alive, and they brought the people who love them to help with the reason why. He turned to look at her directly. That's not obligation, Rachel. That's not debt. That's what it looks like when something you did actually mattered. Rachel looked at the parking lot full of bikes, and the mobile kitchen, and the fixed roof, and the certified cellar, and the signed tablecloth on the railing, and the brass bell in her pocket, and the town of Briar Glen, Kansas going quiet in the early evening, in the particular way that towns go quiet when the day has been full of something worth being full of. I know, she said. She meant it differently than she had 10 days ago on this same step. 10 days ago, she'd said I know as a declaration, a decision to keep going. A choice made before the cost was fully calculated. Tonight, she said it as a recognition. The settled, arrived feeling of someone who has come out on the other side of something and can finally see its shape from the outside. She picked up the brass bell from her pocket and turned it over in her fingers. 79 engraved on the back. The weight of it, exactly right. Inside the cafe, Danny was cleaning up after the longest day. Either of them had worked in 11 years, whistling something tuneless and slightly off-key the way he always did when he was content. The new roof was solid overhead. The cellar door was reinforced and certified in the ground behind her. Patricia was at the corner table, closing her laptop with the look of a woman who has filed what she came to file. Margaret Holloway had gone home 2 hours ago with a handshake and a promise to testify. Dr. Ferris's office had called at 5 to confirm the state investigation was formally open. The storm that had come for Rachel Monroe's land and her livelihood and her father's legacy and the truth of what had happened to the sirens and the shelter and the 79 people who should have had somewhere official to go, that storm was not over. Not completely. The legal process would take months. Price and Voss would have attorneys and strategies and the accumulated inertia of men who have never before had to account for themselves. But the ground beneath her was solid, and the people on it were real. And tomorrow morning, a structural engineer was going to sign his name to a document saying that the Monroe cellar, the thing they tried to erase in the dark, was certified, legitimate, and permanent. Rachel closed her hand around the road bell. She thought, Dad, I think we're going to be okay. And for the first time in 10 days, she believed it without reservation. The structural engineer's name was Paul Dietrich, and he had 20 years of field experience and the particular unhurried manner of a man who had learned long ago that rushing a certification was the fastest way to be wrong about something that mattered. He arrived at 7:15 the next morning with a coffee from the mobile kitchen that Big Carl had apparently kept running through the night, and he spent 4 hours in and around the cellar with his equipment and his clipboard before he came to find Rachel in the kitchen. She was making real breakfast eggs, toast, the works for whoever was still on the property, which turned out to be about 40 riders who had camped in the field rather than find motel rooms, and Danny, who had simply never left. Dietrich set his clipboard on the counter and said, without ceremony, whoever built this structure, 1,947, either knew something most engineers didn't know yet or got very lucky. Probably both. He picked a piece of toast without asking. 8-inch walls, properly cured. The drainage is original and still functional. The door hardware needs one replacement hinge. I've already noted the spec, but the frame is sound. He looked at her. Miss Monroe, this cellar is not just certifiable. It's one of the best preserved civilian shelters I have assessed in 31 years of doing this work. Rachel stood at the stove with a spatula in her hand. My father always said his father built things to outlast arguments. Dietrich looked at her over his toast. His father was right. He tapped the clipboard. I'll have the formal certification filed with the county building office by end of business today. Given the current administrative situation in that office, I've also copied the State Emergency Management Division directly. Dr. Ferris's office confirmed they'll accept it. He paused. One more thing. The capacity assessment puts this structure at 112 occupants under emergency conditions. You had 79 people in there and it held with room to spare. Rachel thought about the darkness. The lanterns swinging, Wade's careful breathing. Lena's voice, steady above the pain in her wrist, talking someone through their fear. She thought about 79 sets of lungs moving air in the same concrete room while the world above tried to come apart. It held, she said. It held, Dietrich confirmed. He finished the toast, picked up his clipboard, and left. Rachel put the spatula down and stood at the stove for a moment with her eyes closed. Not crying, just receiving it the way you receive news that you've been waiting for long enough that you stopped letting yourself want it too directly. And then when it comes, it has to find its way through all the protective distance you built around the wanting. Danny appeared at her elbow. You okay? The seller is certified, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then your dad would, I know, she said. Don't. She picked up the spatula. Eggs are going to burn. He smiled and let it go. And they cooked breakfast. And the kitchen smelled like coffee and butter and the particular warmth of a room where people are fed without conditions, which was the smell Rachel associated most directly with her parents and the life they'd built here, and she let herself feel that without pushing it away. The legal machinery moved faster than Rachel had been told to expect. Patricia told her later that this was because Dr. Ferris's office had been building a parallel case on the corridor property acquisitions for months, and Rachel's father's letters with their specific dates, specific officials, specific documented failures had provided the connective tissue between Ferris's investigation and the tornado, between the abstract pattern of misconduct and the specific, human catastrophic consequence of it. 2 weeks after the tornado, Grant Voss was formally charged with fraud and obstruction of county emergency services contracting. His attorney released a statement saying the charges were without merit and politically motivated, which was the statement his attorney would have released, regardless of what the charges were. Nobody who'd been in Rachel's parking lot at 11:20 p.m. with a flashlight and a demolition crew was particularly persuaded. Sheriff Price resigned 3 days before the formal removal proceedings would have concluded. He released no statement. He was 58 years old and had been in office for 16 years, and he left the building on a Tuesday afternoon without speaking to anyone, which the Briar Glen Courier reported in a front-page story that used the word accountability 4 times in 6 paragraphs, and that Roy Sayers cut out and mailed to Rachel with a handwritten note that said simply, "Your father would have read this twice." She read it 3 times. The property acquisitions along the corridor were suspended pending the investigation, and 2 of the 3 landowners who had signed emergency sales agreements in the weeks following the tornado came forward with documentation showing they'd been told they had no legal options. Patricia took both cases. She told Rachel, with professional understatement, that they were strong. New county siren system, 7 units, upgraded sensors, redundant power supply, monthly test protocol with public reporting was installed over 4 weeks by a contractor whose bid had been publicly posted and publicly reviewed. Rachel attended every planning meeting. So did Frank Dellinger, who had resigned from the planning commission the morning after the night of the demolition crew and then been reappointed by the incoming interim county executive on the grounds that contrition was more useful in a chair than outside of one. She was at the final installation meeting when the county engineer walked through the activation protocol for Unit 3, the same unit on the Highway 17 corridor that her father had flagged in his November 2022 letter, the one with the documented sensor failure, the one that had been officially ignored for 2 storm seasons. The engineer ran the test activation. The siren sounded. Rachel was standing 12 feet from the unit. The sound hit her full in the chest. Loud and immediate and completely irrefutably present, and she stood there and let it wash over her and thought about a green-gray sky and 60-mile-an-hour crosswalks and 79 motorcycles over a hill and a red tablecloth and her own feet already moving before she'd made the decision to move. The siren test lasted exactly 45 seconds. When it stopped, the county engineer said something to the official beside him and made a note on his tablet. And the people standing around Rachel began talking again. and Rachel stood very still in the sudden quiet and breathed. Frank Dellinger materialized beside her. He'd been doing that a lot lately, appearing at her elbow at moments when her father would have been there, which she suspected was intentional and which she had decided was a form of respect rather than presumption. "You all right?" he asked. "That's the third time this week someone has asked me that," she said. "Is the answer getting better?" She thought about it. "It's getting more accurate," she said, "which is almost the same thing." He nodded, as though that were a sufficient answer, which from Frank Dellinger it probably was. The certification of the Monroe Maddox community, storm shelter the name had been Patricia's suggestion, quietly floated and immediately accepted by everyone who heard it happened on a Thursday morning in the fifth after the tornado, in a small formal ceremony that Rachel had specifically requested be kept small and formal and brief, because she did not want a party, she wanted a document, and she had learned from her father that those were different things with different weights. Cole was there. He'd driven up the night before and slept in the field, which Rachel only found out when she arrived at the cafe at 5:30 a.m. and saw his bike in the lot. Its chrome catching the pre-dawn in the particular way that chrome catches light when everything else is still gray. She made coffee and brought 2 cups outside and sat on the porch step. And 15 minutes later, she heard his boots on the gravel, and he came and sat beside her without any more ceremony than that. "You didn't have to come back again," she said. "I was in the area," he said. She handed him a cup. He took it. They sat with the quiet for a while. "I keep thinking about something," she said finally. About the night they came with the demolition crew. When I was standing in front of the cellar door, and I said she stopped, heard her own voice in her memory, the words she'd chosen without choosing them. 79 people survived beneath this ground. "You will not erase that because someone wants a warehouse," she said. "I didn't plan to say that. It just came out." "That's when you mean something," Cole said. "When you don't have to plan it." She looked at him. "Did you plan anything you said to me that night on the porch about the door?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I'd been thinking about it for a week, but I hadn't planned to say it that way. It came out the way things come out when you've been sitting with them long enough." Rachel nodded. She drank her coffee. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edge, the specific pale gold that precedes real dawn in a Kansas morning, not dramatic, just the world gradually admitting that it has decided to continue. "Cole," she said, "how many people know the road bell story? What it actually means?" He looked at her sideways. "Every rider. It's not secret. It's just," he searched for the word, "it's not something we talk about to people outside until it's relevant." "Was it relevant when you gave it to me?" "It became relevant," he said, "the moment you ran into the road." She reached into her pocket. The bell was there, where it had been for 5 weeks, and she turned it over in her fingers the way she'd been turning it over since the porch the first time. The weight of it. Exactly right. The engraving on the back, Hell's Angels, 79. "I want to put it inside the shelter," she said, "on the wall, where people can see it." Cole was still for a moment. That would be a significant thing to our people." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm asking instead of just doing it." He looked at the cellar door, visible from the porch, solid and dark and permanent in the pale early light. He looked at it for a long time, in the way he looked at things that he was deciding about seriously. "Yes," he said. "Put it there." The ceremony was attended by 30 people: Patricia, Margaret Holloway, Frank Dellinger, Roy Sayers, Danny, Tara the EMT, Dr. Yolanda Ferris herself, who had driven down from the state capitol and shook Rachel's hand with the particular warmth of a professional who doesn't usually allow herself to feel the personal dimensions of her work and is making an exception. Paul Dietrich was there with his signed certification. Lena was there, her wrist in the final stages of healing, her cast signed by approximately 40 riders whose names Rachel couldn't fully read. Wade was there, standing near the cellar entrance, with his hands in his pockets and a steadiness in his posture that had not been there 5 weeks ago. Cole was there with 11 of the original 79, the ones who lived close enough to make it on short notice, the ones who'd called each other the night before without any formal communication structure. Just because word moved through that community, the way word moves through any community that is actually a community, and not just a collection of people who happen to be in the same place. The county executive, the interim one, the one who had not been in office during any of the things that had happened, read the formal designation into the record. The Monroe Maddox Community Storm Shelter, certified capacity 112, maintained under public oversight by a transparent fund. Available to all residents of Briar Glen and the surrounding district during any declared weather emergency. Available to all residents. No distinctions, no exceptions. No questions at the door about who you were, or what you looked like, or what was written on the back of your jacket. Rachel had written that language herself and had not let anyone change a word of it. After the official part, when people were talking in small groups and Danny had appeared from somewhere with a tray of coffee cups, Wade came to find her. He stopped beside her at the cellar entrance, both of them looking at the door. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The night after the tornado," he said, "when we'd all left and you were back in the cafe. I was on the road somewhere in Oklahoma, and I pulled over because I couldn't stop thinking about the cellar, about what it felt like in there." He paused. "And I realized I wasn't thinking about how scared I was. I was thinking about your voice. Counting in, counting out. I was thinking about the fact that you didn't treat my fear like a problem to be managed. You treated it like information to be addressed. And those are completely different things. And I've been in a lot of situations in my life where the first thing happened and almost none where the second thing happened." Rachel looked at him. "What do you do with that now?" "I joined a veterans support group," he said. "First time in 11 years I've been in a room talking about this stuff with people who've been in similar rooms." He looked at the door. "I went back into enclosed spaces 3 times this week on purpose. Counted my breaths each time. It's not fixed, but I'm working on it." He met her eyes. "I came back because I wanted to tell you that. In person. Because you deserve to know that what you did that afternoon had a longer reach than 79 people walking out of a cellar alive." Rachel stood there and let that reach her. Not pushing it away. Not compressing it into something manageable. Just letting it land at its actual size. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "That matters more than you know." He nodded. He put his hand out and she shook it. And then he did something she hadn't expected. He pulled her into a brief, firm hug. The kind that conveys something that handshakes aren't built for. And then he let go and walked away, and she stood at the cellar door and breathed and let the moment be exactly what it was. The brass bell went up that afternoon. Wade was the one who drove the anchor into the concrete beside the door. He had steady hands. It turned out, and a precision with tools that he said came from engine work, from years of working in the guts of machines where the tolerance for imprecision was zero. He set the anchor, hung the bell, and stepped back, and everyone who was still there gathered around to look at it. It was small against the concrete wall, 2 inches of brass, a ring at the top, an engraving on the back that you had to lift it to see. But it was there, solid and permanent, and Rachel looked at it and felt the 5 weeks of fighting and losing sleep and holding documents in parking lots and counting breaths in the dark and watching her father's meticulous handwriting become. The connective tissue of an official investigation felt all of that settle into the simple, final fact of a bell on a wall beside a door that was certified and funded and real. "What does the sign say?" Roy Sayers asked, reading the plaque Patricia had arranged. He was squinting at it without his glasses. Rachel read it for him. "When the warning comes, this door opens for everyone." Roy was quiet for a moment. "That's good," he said. "That's exactly right." The first annual Briar Glen Disaster Preparedness fundraiser happened 6 months after the tornado, on a Saturday in October, when the weather was clear and cool, and the trees along Highway 17 were turning color in the way that Kansas trees turn color, not dramatically. Just honestly, gold and rust and the occasional stubborn green, the palette of a place that doesn't perform its seasons, just lives them. Rachel had organized it with the County Emergency Management Office, which now had a new coordinator, a woman named Elena Vasquez, who had come from the state level and who had, in the months since her appointment, conducted 5 public meetings, responded to every formal inquiry within 48 hours, and tested the sirens on the first Tuesday of each month at noon with prior public notification. Rachel had attended every meeting and had stopped checking whether Price had responded to her father's letters, because that particular calculation had been superseded by a different one. The fundraiser was in the parking lot of the Prairie Lantern Cafe. There were tables and food not from the mobile kitchen this time, but from a dozen local businesses who had signed up to participate, and a presentation from Paul Dietrich on shelter safety that was delivered in a tone that managed to be simultaneously technical and accessible, which Rachel suspected was a skill he'd developed from 31 years of explaining structural assessments to people who were not structural engineers, but who needed to understand what they meant. There was a table run by Margaret Holloway with information about the County Emergency Planning Committee, which now had 10 members, public applications open. Meeting minutes posted online within 48 hours of each meeting. Margaret had been reappointed by Elena Vasquez and had accepted with the particular grace of a woman who understands that returning to a thing you abandoned is harder and more important than leaving it was. There was a table run by Wade, which surprised Rachel when she first saw it, and which turned out to be a resource table for veterans experiencing anxiety and panic disorders in post-emergency situations. He'd worked with a licensed counselor from the VA to put the materials together, and he staffed it himself with the same directness he'd brought to everything since October, not performing wellness. Not pretending the work was done, just showing up and being honest about where he was and what he knew. Rachel stopped at his table midway through the afternoon. He was talking to a man she didn't recognize, middle-aged, the particular self-consciousness of someone who has walked up to a table he needs, but isn't sure he wants to be seen needing. Wade was leaning on the table with both forearms, not behind it but beside it, which Rachel recognized as a deliberate choice, same level. Same side, not across. She didn't interrupt. She watched for a moment and then moved on. And she felt something she would have had trouble naming precisely, but that was close to. This is the reach. This is what it looks like when one thing extends past itself. The original 79 came back for the fundraiser. Not all at once, they arrived in small groups through the morning, parking in the field where their bikes had been scattered 5 months ago, walking into the parking lot and finding each other the way people find each other in a place they share a specific memory of. Rachel was behind the cafe counter when she heard the particular sound of Lena's voice cutting through the general noise of the morning that ER nurses carry, the voice that doesn't need to be loud because it's always been trained to be clear. And she came out from behind the counter and found Lena in the middle of the parking lot holding a cast-free arm out for Rachel to look at. "Done," Lena said. "Full range of motion. My physical therapist is insufferably pleased with herself." Rachel took Lena's hand and turned it over, checking the wrist the way she checked it 5 months ago in the cellar elevated, looking for swelling, looking for the signs. There were none. The wrist was whole. "You should be insufferably pleased with yourself too," Rachel said. "I'm working on it," Lena said. She squeezed Rachel's hand before releasing it. "How are you?" "Actually." Rachel thought about the genuine version of the answer. "The cafe is better than it was before the storm," she said, "which I didn't expect. Businesses, I don't know. People come in differently now, like they've decided something about this place." She paused. "I sleep better than I did in September. I check the weather radar every morning, which I'll probably do for the rest of my life. But I do it from a place of information now, not from a place of whatever I was doing before, hoping things would be okay without actually making sure they could be." Lena looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of a woman who has looked at a lot of people across a lot of treatment tables. "That's called wisdom," she said. "It's uncomfortable to acquire and useful forever. My father would have said that better. Your father sounds like he was an exceptional person." She glanced at the cellar door, visible from where they stood, with the brass bell on the wall beside it. "He built something that lasted. He built a lot of things that lasted, Rachel said. She looked at the cafe, the repaired roof, the restored kitchen, the open sign in the window that had been there. Every day since the morning she came back from the hospital after checking on the two riders who needed more than field care. I just had to figure out which ones to protect. Cole arrived at noon, which was when she'd expected him, because Cole Maddox was, she had learned, precisely punctual in a way that had nothing to do with clocks and everything to do with intention. He came into the parking lot and found her without looking for her. The way you find someone in a space when you've calibrated your attention to them specifically. The tablecloth, he said by way of greeting. Inside, she said, "Come see," she'd had it framed. A simple frame, clean glass, mounted on the wall of the cafe between the window and the old photograph of her parents, standing in front of the original prairie lantern. Sign the one from 1962, when her grandmother had opened it, the sign that had been repainted 3 times, but never replaced. The tablecloth filled the frame exactly. The red fabric bright against the white border, the 79 signatures in their various handwritings covering every inch of the border space. Cole stood in front of it for a long time. Rachel stood beside him and didn't say anything, because some things don't need narration. "Wade's signature is at the bottom left," he said finally. "I know." He pointed it out. "His handwriting has gotten steadier," Cole said. She looked. It was true. The signature at the bottom left was deliberate and clear, nothing tentative in it, the name written by a hand that knew what it was signing and had decided to mean it. "A lot of things have gotten steadier," Rachel said. Cole turned away from the tablecloth and looked around the cafe at the repaired ceiling, at the frame certification from Paul Dietrich on the far wall, at the photograph of Preston Monroe, at Danny behind the counter, moving with the particular ease of someone who has stopped being surprised by what his day might contain. "You know," Cole said, "when I pulled over and saw you in the road with that tablecloth, my first thought was that you were trying to flag us down because something was wrong with our column. A rider down maybe, or a road hazard." "Something was wrong," Rachel said. "Just not with your column." "No," he looked at her. "My second thought about half a second later, when I saw the sky behind you, was that whoever this woman was, she just made a decision that most people wouldn't make. I didn't think about it that way." "I know. That's what made it the thing it was." He looked back at the tablecloth. "You didn't run into that road because you calculated that it was worth the risk. You ran because there were people in the way of something dangerous, and you had information that could help them. That's just who you are." Rachel stood with that for a moment. She thought about the arithmetic she described to Cole in the pre-dawn, on the porch, subtracting what you can't control, adding what you can. She thought about her father at this same kitchen table, with his legal pad and his small, precise handwriting and his conviction that documentation was a form of dignity, that making the truth concrete and preserving it carefully was one of the most important things a person could do with the time they had. She thought about 79 people breathing in the dark. She thought about Wade counting to 4. She thought about the siren test on the Highway 17 corridor, the sound hitting her full in the chest, the world admitting it was present and functioning and paying attention. She looked at Cole. "You know what I've been thinking about? Tell me." "The next storm," she said. Not in a fearful way. She searched for it in a ready way. "The sirens work. The shelter's certified. Elena's office has a response protocol that's been publicly reviewed. Patricia has got 2 landowners their documentation back. Wade is running a table in my parking lot. Margaret is on the committee." She looked at the tablecloth, the 79 signatures. "The next storm is going to come. That's just Kansas. But the next time the sky turns green and the air pressure drops, and people need somewhere to go this time, they'll have somewhere to go." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Then, and the time after that." "And the time after that," she agreed. Outside, the fundraiser was in full swing, the sound of it coming through the cafe windows. Conversations and laughter, and the particular noise of a community, doing the work of being a community, which was louder and messier and more alive than the silence of a community that had stopped trying. Rachel could hear Roy Sayers arguing good-naturedly with someone about the proper ratio of coffee to water. She could hear Elena Vasquez answering questions with the patient clarity of someone who has decided that her job is to make people less afraid, not more impressed. She could hear the riders in the parking lot, the Hells Angels from 4 states who'd come back again, because that was what the road bell meant. You came back. You showed up. You kept showing up. She walked to the door of the cafe and stood there for a moment, looking out at the parking lot, at the field, at the rows of bikes, at the people moving through the afternoon with purpose and ease, at the cellar door in the ground behind the building with the brass bell on the wall beside it and the sign above the door that she'd painted herself the week after the certification. When the warning comes, this door opens for everyone. The sky above Briar Glen was clear and blue, and entirely itself not the green-gray of disaster, not the flat gray of aftermath, just an October Kansas sky doing what October Kansas skies do, which was to be present and enormous and indifferent in the way that the sky is always indifferent, leaving the caring to the people underneath it. Rachel Monroe stood in the doorway of her parents' cafe, in the town she had never left and had never regretted not leaving. And she looked at everything her father had built and everything she had protected, and everything she 20 people and 390 people and 1 county attorney and 1 structural engineer and 1 retired ER nurse and 1 veteran learning to breathe in small spaces and 1 tired old neighbor who came out after 9 p.m. with his car keys had made possible by showing up when it counted, and she felt not relief, not triumph, not the particular collapse of finally she felt the steady, grounded weight of a life that had found its shape. The afternoon was full and warm and real. Preston Monroe had built the cellar to hold. Rachel Monroe had held everything else. On the day Briar Glen judged people by their clothes, Rachel Monroe judged them only by whether they needed help. She opened 1 door, and that 1 door, held open by 1 woman who chose to run toward the storm instead of away from it, became the shelter that saved far more than 79 lives. It became the proof, written in concrete and brass and 79 signatures on a red tablecloth, that the most powerful thing any person can do in the face of a storm is simply refuse to close the door.